Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Professor Neeraj Sood. I'm the founding director of the USC Open Dialogue Project. Welcome, all of you. This is, yet another open dialogue organized by the project, as well as with the Center for Political Future. As in all open dialogue events, I have three expectations. One is let go of winning. So this is a dialogue. This is not a debate. Second is be curious. We are here to learn, understand issues. You don't have to agree with issues, but at least be curious to figure out what the issues are. And the third is to focus on ideas and not people. So you can criticize an idea as much as you want, but don't label people. That's not a productive conversation. And the last is there'll be plenty of time for Q&A, so don't interrupt or disrupt the conversation. I am very excited to welcome Jonathan Turley, who's going to talk about his new book, Rage in the Republic, and he'll be in conversation with Professor Morris Levy. So welcome all.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Morris Levy. I'm a professor of political science and international relations at Dornsife, and it is my great honor and privilege to be able to speak with Professor Jonathan Turley. Professor Turley is a law professor, columnist, television analyst, and litigator. Since 1998, he has held the Shapiro Chair for Public Interest Law at George Washington University. He has served as counsel in some of the most notable cases in the last 2 decades, including representing members of Congress, whistleblowers, judges, 5 former attorneys general, celebrities, accused spies and terrorists, journalists, protesters, and the workers at Secret Facility Area 51. Oh my. He's testified before Congress more than 100 times, including during the Clinton and Trump impeachments. I think I have heard all of his testimony. He's written for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the LA. Turley has worked as a legal analyst for CBS, NBC, BBC, and Fox. A study by Judge Richard Posner found Turley to be 38th in the top 100 most cited public intellectuals, and the second most cited law professor, according to AI, behind Posner himself only. On a more personal note, Professor Turley has been a constant presence over decades in the endless email debates that animate the assorted factions of Levy family politics, and I am sure that my family is not alone. To me, your career exemplifies how scholars can illuminate the public square, and you always give us something important to think about. So let me start by asking you to explain your approach in this book. Half of which is history, and then the second half of which is more contemporary. You start with a primer on the trials, tribulations, and hard knocks education of Thomas Payne, the irrepressible Thomas Payne. Then you move to a tale of 2 cities, revolutionary Paris and revolutionary Philadelphia. But it's really 3 cities. Athens is lurking quite explicitly in the background. We often think of Athens as sort of a model, a monument to the origins of democracy, and we're proud of that. But it was also, as you describe, a basket case that presided over the trial of Socrates, a military fiasco, economic chaos, and general political instability. It's a cautionary tale. So can you tell us why you feel it is so important to reach back 2,000 years and also about 200 plus years in history to understand the present moment? What are the key lessons?
Well, thank you so much. Let's see, is this on?
You could
Hello? Oh, there we go. Thank you so much. I didn't want the introduction to end, but the question that you raise is very profound. This is really a book about revolution and the rage that leads people to revolt. It's far easier to start a revolution than to end one. And the first half of the book looks back at what were the unique elements that went into the American Revolution. And it does this comparison that you note of these two cities of Philadelphia and Paris, because after the American Revolution, there was violence growing in both cities. And the Philadelphia chapter talks about the battle of what's called the Battle of Fort Wilson, which was really the home of Wilson, James Wilson. Where cannon were brought out, people died. There was a very violent skirmish in the streets. But then suddenly it stabilized. And the American Republic went on to become the oldest and most successful democratic system in history. And the French Revolution went on to become the terror. And the reason I talk about Thomas Payne is that he was one of two central figures that was involved in both revolutions, the other being Lafayette. And it was a very telling experience for Payne because I must admit I became obsessed with Payne over the course of writing this book. I drove my children crazy. He is, in my view, the most interesting historical figure I've ever researched. And in many ways, he was the most revolutionary of the American Revolution. And he was this odd character. He had no friends. He was contrarian. He is, without question, in my view, the most principled person of his generation. And in some ways, he was, as I talk about in the book, the righteous rage of the American Revolution. And it was essential to have him at that time. What I mentioned in the book is that Thomas Payne came to this country 2 years before the Declaration of Independence. And he came to this country as a human wreck. He had failed in everything he had ever tried. He had been fired from every job he ever had. Every business he created went bankrupt. His marriages collapsed. He was an utter failure. And he appeared in London in front of a man who looked at this pile of human wreckage, this penniless, unpopular, unkept individual, and saw something in there. And that person was Benjamin Franklin in London. And Franklin not only sent him to the United States, he paid for him to go to the United States because Payne had no money, and wrote his son, the governor, and said, we have to let this man write. And so he arrives 2 years before the Declaration of Independence. Within 2 years, he would be called the penman of the American Revolution. But Payne didn't agree with the limitations, some of the limitations that James Madison wanted for our constitutional system. The difference between Philadelphia and Paris, the reason suddenly it stopped, that was the true miracle of Philadelphia. It just stopped. The violence. And the only thing that occurred between those two events was the ratification of the U.S. Constitution, which was not popular in Pennsylvania. It barely passed. But suddenly people believed that they had skin in the game, that there was an alternative to going into the streets and fighting to prevail over your opponents. That didn't happen in Paris. And Payne was never enthusiastic about the limitations on democracy. And you said it well, that the founders did not want the Athenian democracy. It was what one of the founders called a mobocracy. And it showed how democracies can devour themselves. And Payne went to Paris wanting more of a direct democratic system, and it came damn near to killing him. It came within 24 hours of his being guillotined. And he ultimately came to see the wisdom of Madison's, what were called auxiliary precautions. But the book begins, and I'm sorry about this long answer, but the book begins with a quote from one of the figures of the French Revolution who said that revolutions like Saturn devour their own. And this is a reference to Saturn or Kronos, who ate his children and ultimately was overthrown by Zeus. the founders were deeply aware that past democratic systems had devoured their own, had become mobocracies, and they did not want to replicate that. So they created something truly unique in the American Republic. And that's what the book looks at in the first half. And then the second half looks forward at whether that republic can survive in the 21st century, can survive what's coming from robotics to AI, can survive us. Whether we can keep the republic, as Benjamin Franklin would say.
Thank you. That's wonderful. Let me stay with history for just a moment before turning to the present. I have two questions that I had kind of throughout as I was reading the book and that I think I have an answer to, but I'm curious how you would address. One is, was it really the provisions of the Constitution itself or the existence of the Constitution that stopped the bloodletting in Philadelphia? They had a constitution in revolutionary France. It fell apart. Or was it something in the culture and background that that laid the seeds for disaster in one situation and terror, but allowed for a constitution to take root in the other? In other words, is it legal provisions and institutional restraints, or is it something in the culture?
Well, that's a great question. And in the Raging Republic, I talk about the differences, and you're right to raise that. The founders recognized the difference. Jefferson, for example, noted how different the two countries were. The United States was relatively prosperous. I mean, most Americans were relatively well off in comparison to France. France had dire poverty, the type of which that very few Americans had faced. And also they had had generations of very repressive systems, a very class sort of stagnant, calcified system. The whole system was teetering on bankruptcy. The irony, by the way, is that we may push the system over the edge because the French monarchy saw the American Revolution as a way to stick a finger in the eye of the English, maybe even take over some of what they lost from England. And so they helped finance our revolution. That actually may have been the death knell for the monarchy, because they were already in debt and it pushed them to a point of economic collapse. But it was really that pent-up anger. But it comes down also, in my view, to that legal system, because we had a lot of those pressures in the United States. And we saw that in Philadelphia in the fighting at Fort Wilson. What the French didn't have was a system to vent the pressures. That was the genius of Madison. You know, Thomas Payne knew what it would take to move a people to revolution. It was James Madison that knew what it would take to move a revolution to a republic. And so you needed both. You needed the righteous rage of Payne, and you need that sort of pious logic of Madison. And that combination created something very, very special. The various constitutions, one of the constitutions that was drafted by Lafayette with Payne's support. They had met, but they really got to know each other in Paris. And they associated themselves with the more moderate wing of the Jacobins, the Girondins. And the problem is that the Girondins was always outmatched by what was called the Mountain, which is associated with figures like Marat and Robespierre. And they just simply never had it. They could never outrun the mob on this one. And so ultimately, many of the Girondins were executed by the Mountain. The Constitution that they drafted never went anywhere. And that Constitution did have some of the auxiliary precautions. And instead, they had what I call a sort of Rousseauian system, because many of the Jacobins were infatuated with Rousseau. And the problem is that Rousseau had extremely naive aspects to his writings about government. He was a beautiful writer, but he believed in what he called the general will. And Payne sort of believed this too, that if you unleash the democratic freedoms of a people, that people are basically good. And so the general will be good. So all you have to do is unleash the general will and it'll all turn out pretty darn well. Of course, that's not what happened. And the general will became a mobocracy, and tens of thousands of people were executed.
One more question about, I guess you'd say, the mechanism. Now, empirically, as a pattern, we know that revolutions have this tendency to go too far and to turn pretty ugly if they're not couched in some kind of institutional restraint, transition to a republic. Why, in your view, does that happen? I mean, you say Payne had this sort of naive view about human nature as good, brought from Rousseau. We see some of that echoing, I think, in our own times. It'll all work out. It doesn't all work out. Why?
Well, Payne actually learned that lesson that Payne's, the reason I obsess so much about Payne is that every part of his life is just so intriguing. But what's most intriguing is that he survived as long as he did. In many ways, the American Revolution, as I point out in the book, was saved by corset making. That Payne's father was a corset maker, a stay maker, and he was trained as a corset maker. He hated it. And he actually, at one point, decided to become effectively a pirate. He joined a privateer that they would just advertise back then, and a man by the name, I kid you not, you can't make up these details, named Captain Death advertised for him to come. They were looking for basically privateers or pirates. It was legal piracy essentially, and he got on that ship. And here's the intriguing aspects. Corset making was on the decline because corsets were on the decline, and you're welcome. And so it was going the way of the buggy whip. And so, but the amazing thing is there was this network of corset makers that apparently was the most efficient intelligence system in anywhere in the world. And so his father put out the word, I'm looking for my son among corset makers, and they found him and they told him he's on the ship. He's going to be a pirate. And so he goes and gets Payne to leave the ship. And the reason that's so incredible is the ship then went out and went colliding with a French privateer named the Vengeance. And the Vengeance destroyed the ship. So of 177 crew on the ship, all but 17 were killed. So it's very likely Payne would not have survived. But then in the French Revolution, he was saved again by a swinging door, that he was to be executed. And Payne was always rather sick. He was sort of frail physically. And so he was in with 3 Belgian characters who were trying to make him as comfortable as possible. And this was in the Luxembourg Palace dungeon, and it was just basically a processing for the guillotine. And so every night they would write the number of people to be killed in the cell, and there were 4 people in the cell, so they wrote 4. And that night that meant that all 4 would be executed. Well, when Payne became really sick, the Belgians convinced the turnkey to open the door for air, and when he did that, he pushed the number against the inside wall. So when they collected people that night, they walked right past the cell. Otherwise, Payne would have died that night. And this is a long explanation, but when you read Payne's writings, there is a realization that the French Revolution had become a terror. He had experienced himself. He changed his positions on things like he was a big advocate of unicameralism. He dropped that. He became more tolerant of having different interests in government. All of that came through his experience.
Let's stay on Payne for just one more minute. Your feelings about him are about as complicated as he is. They evoke even one of my 2 favorite literary references in the book. The other one is to Kurt Vonnegut. We'll get to that. But this one was to a film noir reference, to a quotation. The quotation is from a fraught romance, and it is, I love you so much, I just wish I liked you. Can you explain why you feel that way about Thomas Payne? I am a film noir nut, and that also drives my children crazy, who they just want a film with color on occasion. But I put that quote in to try to explain
my feelings towards Payne. It was a great line delivered by Robert Ryan to Joan Fontaine, who Joan Fontaine was the world's greatest femme fatale. And in this movie, she had just devoured every man in her life. And Robert Ryan delivers that line when he realizes that she has lied to him as well as everyone else in her life. And the fact is, I really do love Thomas Payne. I just wish I liked him. I guess why I like him is he was brilliant and he was principled. But he alienated everyone. Payne's a weird character because he was brilliant when it came to humanity, but he was clueless when it came to humans. He never really figured out how to deal with human beings. And he ended up, he couldn't go into a pub without starting a fight. He was so contrarian. And everyone left him in the end. He was buried virtually alone. There was 4 people when he was buried. And I say in the book, Benjamin Franklin's daughter said at one point, it would have been better if Thomas Payne had died right after Common Sense. And what I know in the book is she was one of his friends. So this was actually coming from one of the few friends Thomas Payne had who said, gee, it would have been so much better if you had just, died right then and there with it. But even the most reluctant characters, Payne was never accepted. Maybe it's sort of why I like him, is that he was always an outcast. He was never accepted. The founders didn't particularly like him. They preferred, as we do today, they prefer figures like Thomas Jefferson. He's handsome and erudite and educated, and also back then, a slaveholder. Payne was vehemently against slavery and was one of the earliest writers, and he wrote beautifully on the subject. He was not what they had in mind. And I think that people like John Adams resented him as a sort of Johnny-come-lately. This guy, it literally leaves a ship in Philadelphia on a stretcher. A complete human wreck, and in 2 years he's called the penman of the American Revolution. That does not sit well with John Adams. But I do quote one thing from Adams, which is the kindest thing I found that he said, which when Common Sense was published, it was anonymous. And there was a huge amount of speculation as to who wrote this thing. So Adams' wife writes to him and says, everyone's saying it's you. And Adams writes back and he says, I could never have written that, but I think I know who did. He said, a while back, I met a man named Thomas Payne, and he relayed to her that he had genius in his eyes. And I actually, funny enough, as one of Payne's critics, Adams may have summed up this sort of almost magical quality to Thomas Payne. Adams had seen what Franklin saw in London, that there was something about this person. And it was a truly magical element that would ignite the American Revolution.
That was one of the nice things that Adams said about Payne. You'll have to read the book to pick up on the style of erudite insult that characterizes some of the others. Let me turn to the present, and I don't know if this is dopey, but I thought it's not an easy thing for me to do, but I thought I'd try to put myself in the position of a Gen Z American Jacobin. Why Gen Z? There are Jacobins of all ages that you describe in your book. For one thing, I'm familiar with Gen Z through teaching. And for another, I don't want to offend my colleagues, which are potentially the other group of Jacobins that I'm familiar with. Not all of them. I wanted to kind of go piece by piece with a few of what I thought might be likely reactions to some of what you argue about the present and see how you'd respond. So I'll start, and this is AI assisted because I don't know the lingo. Hey, professor, your book was low-key fire, but some of it is sus and a few things are just delulu. First, you got us twisted. We aren't Montagnard radicals. We're moderate Jacobins. We're about institutional reform, not revolution. You overstate our support for political violence. The polling that suggests it's widespread is not great polling. Better polling suggests it's 3 or 4% of us that are down with that cause. We don't want censorship like old Robespierre. We want hate speech laws like what they have in Europe. In every other democracy, we want restraints in an era where social media is running wild. Same deal with the Senate and federalism. Why do we need these things? Other democracies operate okay without them. They're not collapsing. Also, some of the institutions that you praise are complicit in a lot of the problems that we've had throughout American history. We needed a civil war to get rid of slavery. The Constitution was incapable of doing that. We had 100 years of apartheid. We have what you acknowledge to be a major problem with income inequality, and although you cite massive social mobility at the very top, below that rarefied air of the Forbes 400 that tends to have a lot of churn, we don't see as much mobility as we would like. How can you call us radicals about to roll out the guillotine?
Well, a couple of responses, and actually in many ways that makes the case for what I say in the book, because it's very common. For example, on the free speech issue, and I'm associated with the free speech community. I've been called a free speech absolutist, which is not, I think, true. But I admit that my default is with free speech. And when I often face people who say, I'm not for censorship, I'm just for censoring hate speech. And then the definition of hate speech is quite general. And but they say, I'm not for censorship. Well, you are for censorship. And that's what Europe has done, is they have expanded the definition of hate speech to the point that free speech is in an absolute free fall. And, I recently spoke in Berlin not long ago, and at the World Forum, I was one of only two free speech advocates there. It was probably the most anti-free speech conference I've ever been in my life. And we had some interesting exchanges, and one of them was with an EU member from Germany. And I said, I'm glad we're holding this in Germany, because you've been at this now for decades, censoring what you call hate speech. And you now have one of the most robust censorship systems in the world. How's that going for you? Because I look on the news every night and there's tens of thousands of skinheads marching in your cities. You've had a dent when it comes to neo-Nazis, but a recent poll showed that only 17% of Germans feel comfortable speaking publicly about their values. That's how you've succeeded. You're silencing the wrong people, but of course you're not all about censorship, right? You just say you're censoring hate speech, and you define hate speech broadly. In terms of the younger generation, the book actually suggests that there are different groups within younger generations. I actually suggest in the book that they're not as monolithic as people suggest they are, that there are very impressive polls showing that young people do get the importance of this freedom. But when the quotes that you gave of, well, we just want to change the Constitution, change some of these institutions, let me make 2 points, one historical and one contemporary. I do call many of these voices the new Jacobins, and some of my friends and colleagues have objected, and I knew they would. I'm not saying, and I say in the book, that they are little Robespierres. But I also note in the book that if you read Robespierre's writings from the beginning of the Jacobin movement, you would think he was an ACLU lawyer. He talks about due process and the rights of man and all of these wonderful things. Within a couple years, he would say that terror is virtue and would be signing off on warrants to murder people by the thousands. So it's not that you're going to become Robespierre, but you have to have an awareness of the costs of taking out these elements. The whole point of this book is to try to identify the elements that brought us here today, the elements that gave us the stable system. Many of the voices that we're hearing today are zeroing in on those very elements. The things that stabilized us at the beginning of this republic are the things that people want to remove. They want to pack the Supreme Court. There's a lot of professors that are arguing we can change the Senate even without a constitutional amendment. There's all these efforts to have more direct democratic influence. Those are the very things that, if you remove them, could be an existential threat to the survival of this republic. I believe that we will thrive in the 21st century, but only if we preserve those things that got us here. Now, what people say is, oh, well, you're ignoring that we have a failure in the system. You've got, Erwin Chemerinsky, who's a wonderful academic, but he just wrote a book saying that the Constitution is essentially a failure and no Constitution lasts forever. And I have a colleague who wants to amend the First Amendment because she says it's aggressively individualistic, which I think is sort of funny because, yeah. I mean, what people often forget is that the American Revolution was the first Enlightenment revolution. That's what made us unique. We were the first Enlightenment revolution. And we fascinated people in Europe because of that, because they didn't know what to do with us. We had nothing in common with each other. We didn't have land, we didn't have culture, we didn't have religion, we didn't have these class structures. We were a bunch of strangers who created a new country based on a legacy of ideas. That had never happened in the history of the world. And I mentioned in the book, there was a wonderful Frenchman at the time called Crèvecoeur. And he wrote very beautifully. He wrote a piece in French that was a hit in France. And he talked about what he had discovered in America. But the line that I quote the most is where Crèvecoeur says that he has this one line that says, "What then is this America?" He has, "What then is this America?" Many of the Europeans viewed us as like a different species, that we had created, there was something about this place. It is sort of like, what was said by Locke when he said, at the beginning, all was America. It's not just that this was an undiscovered land. It was a land that didn't have the sort of calcified class structure, the heavy laden history that really weighed down every other revolution. In the beginning, all was America. It was a new place where you could be something new. And that's why I'm fixated on Payne, because he may be the quintessential American. He came here to be something new. He even added an E to his name and became a brand new Thomas Payne. And he found the thing that he had to offer the world was in his head all along. But to him, he came here because this was a place where you could write your own manifest destiny. And so I guess the question I have for my young friend being quoted is, if we're going to survive the 21st century, we have to answer Crèvecoeur's question. What then is this American? What are we? What were we then? What are we now? If we can't answer that question, then no, we won't survive the 21st century, not intact. But there is something about us when we ask that question that may resonate deeply within people, maybe an echo of what we were. We are still unique. These are revolutionary times, but we are still a revolutionary people because of who we are. And so that's the key to surviving what's coming. I don't have faith. I just spoke in Prague and probably alienated too many people, but I was asked, they asked, you're very optimistic about the U.S. Republic surviving. What do you think about the EU? And I said, I would bet against you. I think the EU will collapse because you have destroyed the very elements that I talk about in the book that you will need. And I think that you won't survive. And what worries me is when you collapse, historically, that is when we've seen tyranny. That's when we have seen dangerous conditions. And you've torn apart the things we need. That's what we have to avoid in this country. If we stay faithful to the system that brought us here, we won't just survive the 21st century, we will thrive.
Well, I can't answer that as a Gen Z Jacobin, but I can ask you another question, which maybe we'll do a briefer answer on. It's a bit of whataboutism, as they say. What about Trump and MAGA? You bring them up a number of times in the book. But hey, you're picking so much on us. There are pages upon pages of Looney Tunes professors, wacko journalists, all of these people, and there are, I think, only a few sentences on the January 6th riot. You say, I think at one point, critics have also labeled Donald Trump as a demagogue for his appeal to nationalism and promises of prosperity. That might be putting it a bit mildly, I think. You have a few other. It would not be accurate to say that you let the right off the hook. You challenge them for attacks on the judiciary, for example. It comes up in several places. But the balance of the argument is that the problem is coming from the political left, or the risk is from the political left. And I'll just say, one other thing. We've seen attacks on free speech coming from the administration itself, on the free press. What accounts for your orientation in the book, your emphasis, and what would you say to that criticism?
No, it's a fair criticism, and I was aware of it when I was writing the book. Part of the reason is that in the Indispensable Right, I talk about January 6th a great deal, and so I didn't want to repeat a lot of that discussion. And that book is critical of Trump in some of the things he's done, and I've been critical of Trump and some things he's done, particularly in the free speech area. My students will tell you I haven't liked a president since James Madison, and that's true. I've criticized every president in my lifetime, including the current one. The reason of the emphasis on the left is that the voices, the sort of Jacobin voices that you hear about changing the constitutional structure, are largely coming from the left. This sort of structural changes that I wanted to address in the book, because the book is really about revolutions and rage and how they can devour themselves. The threat in terms of constitutional change is coming from the left. The rage, as I say in the book, is also present on the right, but it's really those calls for scrapping the Constitution or scrapping elements of the Constitution that are currently coming from the left, and that's the reason I address it. I come from a liberal democratic, politically active family in Chicago. I grew up on the left in politics, and I understand the left. But this book is really trying to be something of a clarion call, something of an effort to get people to stop and think about the implications of what is being proposed by so many professors. And most professors today are from the left. Most universities run now from the left to the far left. There's been a sort of purging of libertarian and conservative faculty. So once again, talking about academia, you're necessarily talking about the left, because there's very few people that are not on the left in the academy.
You could say the same about journalism, at least if we're talking about the mainstream or legacy media. Thank you. We've been through the past. We've been in the present. I'd like to turn some to the future and back to Kurt Vonnegut, who I guess we share some admiration for, and the book Player Piano, where people essentially prepare robots to take over their lives. People have lost, in a sense, their core aspect of being producers, which was something that was central to philosophies ranging from Marx to John Locke and Adam Smith. So this has been a core element of how we understand ourselves, and now it's tenuous. How are these technological forces going to affect democracy, liberalism, classical liberalism, and freedom in the future? And what kind of upheaval should we expect? And can you elaborate some on your idea of a liberty-enhancing economy? What are the elements of that, and how are they equipped to address the really monumental disruptions that are coming our way, that are already happening?
Well, it's another great question. Let me work back on the question. The liberty, what I talk about as a liberty-enhancing economy, reflects the fact that this is the 250th anniversary, not just of the revolution. It's the 250th anniversary of the publication of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. And the work was not a huge hit in Europe. Even with the Scottish Enlightenment movement, it was not a big hit. It was a big hit here. And so the founders immediately recognized that his political economic theory was the perfect economic companion as a theory to their political theory, their Enlightenment theory. That's what the Declaration of Independence is, a purely Enlightenment document. It doesn't talk about democracy. It doesn't mention democracy once. It talks about liberty, that the point here is to guarantee liberty for individuals. But they immediately recognized that there could be no true liberty unless people were economically independent. And what attracted them about the capitalistic or free market systems of Adam Smith was this idea that markets would be driven by this sort of invisible hand of people making decisions, drawing what they want out of a market. There are no moving governmental parts. It was the market being propelled by citizens. It was the combination of that economic and political system which led to the years of prosperity and growth in the United States. Now, what I talk about in the 21st century is we have to preserve this liberty-enhancing economy. We cannot be a kept population. And so what worries me is I look very deeply at the combination of robotics and AI, and I take the most conservative estimates on the job loss that will come from that. We're looking at a massive loss of jobs that we have never seen before. And we're looking at what could be a permanently unemployed population, people who are unemployable effectively in this. We're going to wipe out certain jobs. And it's not just things like truckers. It's going to be radiologists and others are going to be wiped out by the combination of AI and robotics. And so I ask in the book, what are what I call homo-centric jobs? And for those of you who are Trekkies, you'll like this part because I ask, what are Guinan jobs? And Guinan was the bartender of 10 Forward on the spaceship Enterprise. And when I was growing up watching that series, I was always mystified that Guinan would be at the bar and she would be standing in front of a replicator that could make the perfect Romulan cocktail every single time. And then people would ask her to make them a cocktail, which could not possibly be as perfect as the replicator, which was based on the perfect cocktail, much like player piano. But they wanted Guinan to do it. And so the question I have is, how many Guinan jobs are there where we are going to want human beings to be part of it? And there are a lot of those jobs. And so what the book is cautioning against is what I expect politicians will do. They're very predictable, is that they're going to subsidize failing industry. They're going to subsidize failing jobs. Those jobs are not going to come back. And it's going to be burning that money. What we have to do is be smart about it. The system will catch up. It will shift. But we don't want to, in this critical moment, invest in buggy whips. We're going to have to be more nimble than that because we can't have a kept population. And so, and we also can't have what I call an arts and crafts population where the government just pays us to blow glass and make pottery. That's not going to be the citizen we need in this republic.
Thank you, Professor Turley. I think it's probably time to turn over to the Q&A now. On a final note, just read the book. It will reward you.
Back there? You, yeah.
So you mentioned the French Revolution, and there have actually been multiple republics, and we're actually currently in France on the Fifth Republic. So, and they've also had a restoration of the monarchy in there. They've had empires in there, a whole bunch of instability going back and forth. So what do you think we can learn from the French history on how to make sure we keep our one government and not having a bunch of upheavals and running back and forth to different sorts of government? How do you think we should learn to be more stable?
We can learn a lot. Sometimes when I speak, people come up and say, I just wanted to come because I love reading the U.S. Constitution. And I know that they've never read the U.S. Constitution because nobody would read the U.S. Constitution and say, God, that was great, right? It was written by a wonk. It reads like the IRS tax code. And if you want to read a beautiful Constitution, pick any of the French constitutions. And because they had a lot of practice, they failed so regularly. But the difference was the French would write a revolution that was absolutely, I tell my students, I call it the the I love you Bud Light moment. Remember that old commercial where a guy wants to get your beer and just says, I love you, and you immediately pull the beer back because you know he wants your beer? The French constitutions were also often in that moment. They would talk about what we had in common, this horizon of the rights of man, and they would not deal with the things that we don't have in common. That was the genius of James Madison. He understood that factions are the things that destroy countries, destroy systems. And he flipped the narrative. He actually created a system that would bring factions to the surface, would actually encourage their expression within the legislative process, where they could be modified, they could be compromised. That was the key of the American system. What we have to learn, France had brilliant minds, and I talk about some of them in the book. Most of them were executed. But they had brilliant minds that actually saw much of what we saw in the United States. We can learn from that. In my view, Europe still has not embraced the Enlightenment principles that we created this country on. It includes free speech. That's why I agreed with J.D. Vance when he gave that Munich speech, even though we had the Berlin conference shortly afterwards, and that was not a pleasant experience, but because they were red hot. But he was right. We are now divided from our close allies over core principles like free speech. So we can learn from them, but they can also learn from us. Yes.
As a progressive legal analyst and constitutional scholar, and how he missed it.
Yes.
Yeah, just do you think he's worth engaging with? You know, in his book, allow me to retort. I think he said that the Constitution is kind of garbage.
Yeah, he's called it trash. He's not alone. We have law professors that have called the Constitution a threat to our democracy, and call, like Irwin, suggesting that the Constitution may no longer be viable. I disagree with them, but I think we have to have this dialogue. We have to stop yelling at each other. That's why rage is part of this period. You know, rage is a curious thing. You know, rage allows you to say things and do things that you would not ordinarily say or do. It gives you a license. It gives you a release. And what people won't admit is that they like it, that it's addictive, and that it's contagious. Yeah, I saw that when I was covering the Trump trial. When I came out of that courtroom after the verdict, there were people dancing in the street, just dancing with joy. They like it. And that's not unique to our time. But essentially, we have to wait for the rage to burn off, where we can finally talk to each other about answering that question of what then is this American? Who are we to each other? Because we are having this sort of crisis of faith. And this is an example of it, where some of our citizens don't believe in this system anymore. And that's what we have to talk about.
Hello, Professor Turley. My name is Virat Agrawal. I'm a policy researcher at USC Schaefer Institute. Very thought-provoking comments and ideas. I haven't read your book. It's on my list now.
Don't wait for the movie.
Yeah, but my question is, you talked about surviving in the 21st century, and I want to stretch it to even 22nd century. How much I have understood the American journey, it's all about easy movement of people, ideas, and goods. And that needs investment in the future. When we talk about moon landing or intercontinental highways, the railway system or Erie Canal, it was all about building something that was unimaginable at that time. And when I see the federal outlay today, how our government is running. So I'll just give you a number. 2024, out of $7 trillion federal budget, we spent $6 trillion on status quo, which is defense, entitlement, and interest payment. Just $1 trillion on rest, everything. So my question is, how do we start investing in the future? We have stopped doing things like moon landing. to survive in the 21st century, 22nd century?
I think it's a great question. And I do talk about this a bit in Rage in the Republic, that this is part of what I talk about with the liberty enhancing economy. Part of that, I'm a big believer in the free markets, and that's obvious in the book. I think Milton Friedman ruined me at the University of Chicago. I do believe in the capital being generated towards new industry. What I'm a critic of is when the government tries to pick winners, which they have universally gotten wrong. I mean, with just spectacular collapses of companies that they pick. The Congress and the government should not be involved in picking winners, and they should not be involved in massive subsidies, which have also not been successful. But I also encourage the government to focus on these new industries and new opportunities. We're going to have to develop some of those Guinan jobs are going to come from new industries. We cannot try to just eke out, as in with player piano, to sort of, go back to those jobs because they're not going to come back. This is a scene from Kurt Vonnegut where a wood turner watches these robots mimicking every one of his moves because he was the best wood turner. And when they got the robots going, they fired all the other wood turners, and then they fired him. And so he became like a player piano where they don't need the piano player anymore. That is a stark reality that's going to face us. The only way to avoid that is going to be exploration, new technology. And I look back at what in the book as to how we should frame our policies in terms of the government to get out of the way on that. It's actually not a call for the government to pick winners. I encourage them not to do that. What I encourage them is to reinvest in the sort of free market. And in that sense, we are more nimble than EU. EU is this heavy bureaucratic system that is really about to collapse under its own weight. Even EU countries like Germany are now admitting that their economy is struggling, and yet the EU bureaucracy seems to just grow exponentially. Eventually, that's going to collapse. And it does worry me what's going to be in its aftermath. We have a hand back there.
I think we are at time. Sadly,
right.
Can you believe it? I just wanted to acknowledge and express some gratitude to the folks who were with us today, starting, of course, with Mr. Jonathan Turley. We're so grateful that you made the trek out from D.C. to be here today. Also, want to thank our very capable moderator, Dr. Morris Levy. Morris did a terrific job. Thank you for coming today. I do want to thank the Open Dialogue Project and Dr. Neeraj Sood. So thank you so much for sponsoring today's events. Also want to acknowledge the USC Heterodox Academy. They were also a sponsor of today's event. So thank you for participating. I want to acknowledge my colleagues at the USC Dornsife Center for the Political Future for their investment of time, energy, and love into putting events like this on for our campus community. And I want to invite you, next Wednesday, we're hosting California at 175. So we talked about America's 250 and how we need to your question earlier, invest in the future. USC is making a big bet on the future. That is the whole purpose of this university and higher education in general. We are doing that through these events and through your educations. Next Wednesday is California at 175. Is California stuck? Or are we moving forward? And for that event, if you haven't already registered for it, you can register on your way out. We have some of our students who are at the table right outside, and they can register you for next Wednesday's event, which will also be on campus, which will also include catered food, and we'll take good care of you. And you're going to hear from people who think California is great and people who think we are on the verge of being a failed state. So check that out. In the meanwhile, again, thank you so much, folks. Appreciate you being here today. Fight on.
Thank you.